We are all back, and joining our conversation is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island. He is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, I apologize for the seediness of today's lead story, the subject of Matt Gaetz. But do you feel, I feel sort of a weird combination specific to the time of Trump of relief and deep anxiety about like what was in the box that Matt Gaetz's name came out of, right? Like there was obviously a hat out which came names like Todd Blanche and Mr. Clayton and people who were normal enough. And then there was another hat and the name Matt Gaetz came out of that hat. What do you think is behind Matt Gaetz?
It's very hard to tell. Certainly nothing that's very sane or normal. I think when you want to install as the chief prosecutor of the United States of America, somebody whose only experience with criminal investigations is to be the subject of one, you have really departed from the most fundamental guardrails of normalcy. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and God bless them, sufficient Republican senators sent the message back to the White House that this can't fly, that they ended up withdrawing. I think, a piece of this has been a challenge to the Republican senators by the Trump administration, sort of daring them. There's the legend of the foreign potentate who had the door to his reception chamber built 2 feet high, so everybody had to come in a crawl. This was kind of a crawl test for Republican senators to have to eat awful nominees like Gaetz and Gabbard. And so, the crawl test continues, but it's kind of reassuring that enough Republican senators were willing to be part of the stand-up cohort and not the crawl cohort. And I hope that continues for some of these other appalling nominees.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting observation because in the time of Trump, there is a sort of rinse and repeat dynamic. Trump is appalling. They avoid our cameras for 36 hours and then, that's what the people want. I wonder if you think it's worth wondering whether strength can be a cycle as well, whether drawing a line could beget more lines being drawn with people like Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah, I think that the Trump administration took a surprisingly strong hit here. Think of the past 48 hours with J.D. Vance, our senator's colleague and soon to be vice president, bringing people into his office with Matt Gaetz for come to Jesus sessions to try to pressure them into signing up for a completely unpalatable candidate. And then immediately thereafter, he's withdrawn. Yeah. So the kind of atmosphere of threat and intimidation and pressure and inevitability has been shattered already. And I suspect there's a bit of resentment brewing from those personal conversations. And now that it's been shown that it didn't work, then, so much the better. So to all my Republican colleagues who stood up and made it clear to the White House that this wasn't going to happen, bravo them.
It's important, right, to call that out when it does happen, even though it's rare. It doesn't diminish the fact that at a moment when a lot of the narrative, I'm not sure that it's deserved, is about Trump's political strength. They, when it came to Matt Gaetz, found their spines. I want to read you, to your point about the meetings that J.D. Vance is orchestrating, this was the pitch for Matt Gaetz. This is reporting in the Bulwark. So this is what Matt Gaetz said to senators. Quote, "Look, I'm not going to go there and indict Liz Cheney, have stormtroopers bust through the studio door at MSNBC and arrest Anthony Fauci in my first week," Gaetz told some senators in his one-on-one meetings, according to 2 people familiar with them. It's that last clause, quote, "in my first week," that sounded like an ominous disclaimer to some, and it prompted a few senators to ask with a laugh, what happens thereafter? To which he said, quote, "We're not doing that." Donald Trump's AG nominee then said, quote, "We're breaking the cycle of weaponizing DOJ." I guess the problem with that is that Men like Bill Barr had a hard time stopping Donald Trump's desire to use the IRS and use the Department of Justice against Trump's enemies. That Trump was relentless in this request. And do you think that it is? Do you think that it is a prerequisite for whoever replaces Matt Gaetz atop the Department of Justice that they be willing to do retribution as it's been short-termed?
It would not surprise me, but can we start with the beginning big lie in all of this, which is the question of whether DOJ was weaponized? The question of DOJ being weaponized and, for instance, New York prosecutors and Georgia prosecutors all being part of some weaponization thing is simply the counter narrative to the fact of the matter, which is that Trump is a criminal. And if you who got caught and had to do all sorts of wheedling and weaseling to get out of it where he could, and in other places was either found guilty or found liable. So, you know, behind all of this is an effort to scrub out the underlying fact that the guy that they're supporting, the head of this cult, is in fact a criminal. And when you can't admit that, you've got to go after the prosecutors, and then you get into this cascade of rhetorical consequence that opens up the door for turning that office into the actual weapon that you're pretending it was against Trump.
It's not a lot of sort of hops on the Candyland board game to get from Trump's reelection to Matt Gaetz as the first failed pick to head DOJ to the Supreme Court's granting of absolute immunity for official acts. Where are your sort of worst case scenario concerns these days?
I think the immediate worst case scenario concern would have to do with an abuse of the try to get around advice and consent by adjourning the Senate and then using the recess appointments clause. That ought to be a slam dunk, obvious violation of the Constitution. But I thought presidential immunity was a slam dunk, obvious violation of the Constitution, where, I mean, the Constitution provides for limited legislative immunity, no presidential immunity. So the idea that you read into that a more robust presidential immunity makes no constitutional sense, but they did it. But I really think the spooky thing would be if they allowed more people like Matt Gaetz to get appointed by knocking down the advice and consent process that stopped him.